Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks, and today we are going to be talking about the New Deal. Certainly not the old, well, I guess it's kind of old at this point. So, we're going to talk about the suffering of the Great Depression, Hoover's response, FDR, and then finally FDR's New Deal. So, that's where we're headed. So, the 1920s was a time of peace. You can't talk about the 30s unless you talk about the 20s, I guess. It was a time of peace, and the United States was happy. Whether it was the flappers or the violation of prohibition or the jazz music or the baseball, radio, and all these heroes, it was a time of affluence for many, collectively speaking. But 1929, boom, our economy hits a wall. And the U.S. gets a lot less happy. So that we're going to now talk about the suffering of what that lack of happiness really meant. We're going to paint a picture of what the suffering looks like. So, as of number one, on October 29th, 1929, we experienced what's called Black Tuesday. Basically, that was the day that the stock market got hurt more than pretty much any other day in history. 16 million shares were sold, and that meant prices were crashing, and they did. Now, by 1932, 3 years later, stocks had lost 90% of their pre-Great Depression value. That's huge, 90% of value lost. This gentleman's like, I just need to sell my very wealthy car. I'll take anything. I lost everything in the stock market. Happy to not be him. So money was lost. It wasn't just him. Number two, kind of the view of what the Great Depression looked like. Banks closed, and that meant millions of savings accounts were just gone, wiped from the earth. Three, businesses closed. And that was a huge problem because if once businesses close, their workers lose their jobs and then they can't spend money and more businesses close, an endless cycle. So, and the way that this is kind of proven is GDP is how you measure the health of an economy. It's basically when you add up all the prices of all the goods that are produced in a year in a country, and boom, it went down by about 50%, 55.6 billion. That means our economy was hurting, sick. Not so good. And that meant other businesses were going out of business. People don't spend money. It is a problem. Fourth, unemployment we just talked about. Hardworking individuals no longer had a job. And from 1929 to 30, a year, 3 million people lost their jobs. Now, that's a lot of people back then. Our population was significantly smaller. Look at this picture. All of those people in line to get bread for their family. Free bread given out by their state. And I mean, you pretty much had to wake up at 5 in the morning just to go wait in line to get bread for, one meal on one day. Here's a soup lines, again, just the desperation. In 1930, in just New York City alone, 6,000 people were estimated to be so desperate that, these professionals that had these professional jobs were now on the street selling apples for a nickel. And again, 6,000 individuals hoping that people would buy their apples so they could feed their family. Fifth kind of view of what the Depression was, massive foreclosures. People could not pay their mortgages and therefore they lost their homes. Even worse for people that couldn't pay rent, got kicked out of their homes. Shanty towns were created all across America. Shanty towns basically temporary homes. People would bring a hammer, nails, and some plywood and make a home to live in because they had lost their permanent home. Now, people call these shantyvilles Hoovervilles because why not? After all, people blamed Hoover for the Depression. And if they didn't blame Hoover for the Depression, they blamed him for not fixing it. So poor Hoover. Now, again, much of the country blamed him not for causing the Depression, just not doing anything about it. Hoover blankets, nickname for newspapers because you'd cover yourself with them if you had no blankets or home. Hoover flags, when somebody pulls their pockets out of their pants showing they have no money. So Hoover, people didn't think too much of him at this time. Another aspect of the Great Depression, just shame, basically mental health. Today, people often blame other people for their problems. Definitely something cultural that I've noticed. But back then, in the 1920s and 30s, people blamed themselves, held themselves accountable. I think that's probably a positive cultural trait and at the same time negative. Suicide drastically went up during the Great Depression. Mental health was a problem. Another terrible aspect of the Great Depression, parents went from having so many things to nothing just in a day. And when your family had nothing, it certainly couldn't support its children. 250,000 kids during the Great Depression were rumored to just take off. Their parents couldn't buy them food, so they left. looking for a better life. They gave up their home. They traveled around the country on the railroads because the freight trains, as long as you did it right, were free. And these young teenagers were known as hobos, basically carrying their possessions with them, which was almost nothing, and going from town to town across the country looking for work they probably would never find. So once again, these are the trains with all the hobos on it, trying to just get away from where they were, trying to find a better life somewhere. A lot of times the trains didn't like that, so you'd wait till the train was taken off, then sprint and get on it before the train company could throw you off. So, sad time. Another aspect of the Great Depression was just farmers. Farmers were hurt so much more than almost anybody else because they were already struggling in the 1920s. Over 364,000 farms were foreclosed upon. Farmers lost so much. Such a sad story. Another aspect of the Great Depression, number 9, income deflation. 25% of people lost their jobs, but the other 75% weren't much better off because when you have that many people out of work, so many people were desperate and willing to work for anything that employers would just start paying people so much less because, hey, why not? I could just fire you and pay for somebody unemployed who will accept almost anything, a low salary. So they lowered the salaries of everybody, deflation. So even if you had a job, you weren't necessarily doing all that good. Unemployment drives deflation. Number 10, African Americans. Now, while the unemployment rate might have peaked at 25% nationally, it was closer to 50 to 60% for African Americans. They were the last hired and the first fired. And by first fired, that meant over 50% of African Americans lost everything they had. So there is a massive amount of suffering as part of the Great Depression. So trying to paint a picture of what that looked like because it was just misery. Now, let's not forget, this was a time when there was no unemployment compensation, at least nationally speaking. I mean, some states or local areas had it, but most people did not have access. That meant if you lost your job, you had your family, extended family, your charities to depend on, which most people couldn't. It was a very sad time. So in 1929, we are desperate as a country, and we needed a leader to support us and help us. So now we're going to talk about Herbert Hoover's response. Now that leader turned out to be Herbert Hoover. In 1928, the country was doing well. And he dominated that election, won everything except the solid Democratic South. Now, Hoover even said, we are nearer to getting rid of poverty than in any other land or at any other time. He said, poverty's just gone. The irony, because a year later, 1929, the economy crashes. And that's going to create a wee bit of poverty, I think. So that crash, and this is kind of the stock market, but the economy went down. Herbert Hoover was like, I am not helping though. I'm not giving direct relief, not giving direct money to the American people. And of course, you might say, well, why not, Mr. President? And because he had a laissez-faire philosophy, as conservatives and the Republicans at that time had it. So it's not the job of the government to interfere in the economy. If you have a problem, it's your job to solve it. It's not going to be the government bailing everybody out. Now, you might say, well, does that really make sense? And yes, Hoover said, I believe in rugged individualism. You need to be tough. You need to solve your own problems. It's not the group's job to solve your problems. And he really described that as saying, if the government supports you in this time, it will destroy the character of the nation. And I've seen this firsthand. When you give people things endlessly, they take it for granted. They start thinking they deserve it, and they stop wanting to work hard for it. And that's what he was worried about. Hoover was worried that if the government gave free stuff to people, they would stop working hard, they'd become lazy. And I do kind of agree. People have all types of sides to them, and we need to nurture the part of them that's tough and hardworking. And by giving people things for free, a lot of times that makes the lazy part come out. I see that with my children all the time. My children, I wash their dishes every night, and now I'm trying to get them to wash them, and they're like, no. I mean, what else can I expect? 9 years of them getting it done for free, they've taken it for granted. So perhaps being nice to people, giving them things does drive laziness. Maybe. Or it could just be my children. Who knows? So Hoover literally said, I don't want to destroy the people's belief in their own responsibility and power. And I think there's something to that. In 1929, the American people were angry, and mostly at Herbert Hoover. Now, why? Well, we did just talk about this. Angry, number one. Hoover said, I'm not going to help the people because I want to balance my budget. I don't want to spend money I don't have. That would be irresponsible. I get that, but that pissed the American people off. They're like, help us, help us. He's like, no. Another reason why they're angry at Herbert Hoover, he tried to be optimistic the way leaders are. He's like, don't worry, the worst is behind us. The economy is going to recover. It's going to be better. The depression's over. I am convinced that we have passed the worst, his literal words. And Americans hated that because no, it just kept going. So he turned out to be a liar. Not really. But so the American people were angry at Hoover. He did keep trying to predict the future, that the economy was going up, that we were bouncing back. The business cycle does indeed actually go up and down, and it inevitably has to go up eventually. But the Great Depression proved the exception. It did not go up. And month after month, he's like, it's going to get better, and it will get better. And he proved wrong. He just kept raising hopes only to have them be shattered. And people got upset at Hoover. So fourth reason why they were upset at Hoover, well, he did then try to protect American businesses by passing the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised tariffs, which is taxes on foreign goods to make them more expensive so that Americans buy local goods, which is such a good idea. Intuitively speaking, it's a good idea. But other countries got angry and then raised their tariffs, and what ended up happening was, this chart shows you the buying and selling of U.S. goods, and it went down because nobody was buying our goods and we weren't selling to them because they put tariffs on us. So the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, worst decision ever. So people think Hoover is the worst president ever. So America is sad and angry, but there's hope because in 1932, there is a new presidential election and the Republican Party says, well, who should we run? And apparently they put the most hated man in America to run, and that would be Hoover again because he was president. But the Democrats put up Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And who's going to win that election? Roosevelt. Crushes it. Absolutely crushes it. Takes most of the country. Now that said, Roosevelt gives people a little bit of hope. Good for him. So we're now going to talk about FDR. And in 1932, right after that election, the country had a little bit of a problem, and that was Hoover. He lost the election, but he was now a lame duck. Now that basically means he lost the election in November, but FDR was not going to get inaugurated till March. That's a significant number of months where the American people are like, help us, FDR, but he wasn't able to help us. And during that time, Hoover wasn't willing to do anything because he's like, well, I'm not really president anymore. I mean, I can't do things because the people don't want me to do things. They didn't pick me. So he just kind of does nothing for those 4-something months. And the people suffer during it, during the worst time of the Depression. The suffering is awful. So lame duck, not so good. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt's like, this is awful. So one thing that he pushes after he takes office is we need to change the Constitution. So he pushes the 20th Amendment, which changes the Constitution. There's only ever been 27 amendments. The 20th Amendment says from now on, when a president gets elected, they get inaugurated on January 20th, no longer March. So either way, that hadn't happened yet. So FDR gets inaugurated on March 4th, 1933. Hoover's finally out, and FDR is going to save us, right? Well, we hope. Now, a little background on FDR. Number one, he was from New York, governor of New York. Number two, people consider him one of the best presidents of all time. Most surveys I see him usually ranked 1, 2, or 3. But number three, he got elected 4 times. He served 13 years. So nobody has ever gotten elected more than twice. I mean, FDR was a champ. In fact, he won that many times. The Republicans were so angry that he got that powerful and couldn't be defeated that they actually pushed through the 22nd Amendment afterwards so that no future Democrat or Republican could ever serve more than 2 terms. So that's why we have that today. Thank you, FDR. Now, number 4, FDR was in a wheelchair. But nobody really knew about it. In the 1920s, he had contracted what people thought was polio, but turns out was something probably different that paralyzed the muscles of his legs. Now, he kept it completely hidden. Whenever he took a picture or appeared in public, he was always holding on to somebody. Here's a good example of that. Nobody ever really noticed. He also had braces on his legs that helped. And whenever pictures were taken, FDR was always sitting down. Here he is, Churchill and Stalin. Always sitting down. The American people had no clue. Can you imagine that today? Now, that said, reporters were very respectful of private lives, and they were all the way up pretty much to the 1980s. Not so much anymore. Number 5, presidents can't be successful without the support of their people. Previous presidents really didn't have much connection with the people. Now, it's just too big. Our country's so big, presidents never got out to see anybody. So FDR says, nope, I got a new technology called radio. I'm going to communicate with people all the time and make that strong connection. These weekly radio broadcasts were the fireside chats. People had never been exposed to it, had never had a president that cared enough about them to constantly tell them about that he cared about them and what he was going to do to save them. Now, even if he wasn't saving them, everybody knew that he at least was trying because they heard him talk to him all the time. People just felt like FDR was everybody's second or third grandfather because they were always there as a family huddled around the radio hearing about how much he cared about them. So America fell in love with FDR, and that helped him pass laws because he was unstoppable. Our country loved him, and he used that communication as a weapon, as a tool. Now, that lesson there is if you ever want to have power or influence, you need to really be good at communicating. JFK had weekly press conferences, which revolutionized press conferences so that he would have that power and influence. Obama did weekly YouTube reports to have that type of communication. Trump did it better than anybody else with Twitter. So technology really aided him, just constantly building a fan base and connecting with people and explaining his ideas. Now, the second reason FDR had the American people in his hand loving him was his wife, the greatest first lady of all time, Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, because of his wheelchair, FDR was confined to staying in the White House. So Eleanor Roosevelt had to travel around the country, constantly meeting and looking with people, listening to their stories, finding out how FDR could help them. Here she is just meeting with everybody, finding out their stories. She would then go home and have dinner with FDR and tell him what she had heard and seen and tell him what he needed to do to fix those problems. So she was his right hand and left hand. She fought for women's rights, African American rights. She was very liberal, socially conscious, and so on. Now, that made her kind of a hero to progressives. Now, back in the 1930s, women were supposed to be seen and not heard. She was supposed to decorate the White House, but she was a major law and social leader, and she's going to inspire millions of women and still goes down in history. It's one of the first and greatest first ladies ever. So now let's get to the topic of this presentation, believe it or not, the New Deal. So FDR is beloved and elected in 1933. He's here to save us. Now, what is it, the New Deal? Because the New Deal is what saved us, right? The New Deal was what FDR was offering to the American people. It's a metaphor that the press labeled after one of his speeches. FDR basically said, everybody who plays poker, you get really bad cards. You've been given a terrible deal by the government and society. So I'm going to take back your cards and I'm going to give you a new deal. A new deal, new cards, a new life. And that's what you deserve. So the New Deal begins. Now, the New Deal is about relief, recovery, and reform. At first, FDR wants to give relief, solve people's suffering, and later he's going to try to help people recover and reform, but we're going to talk relief first. During his inaugural speech, because when you get elected, you give a speech, he had that famous phrase, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He's trying to calm the people down. What does that mean exactly? Well, what it means is right now when you panic, and the American people were panicking during the Great Depression, they do irrational and terrible things that actually make things worse. They're driven by emotion. So things are not as bad as they seem. It's your fear that's making things worse. So fear is leading to America running to the banks. This is the best literal example. And when you fear and run to the banks and take all of your money out, that actually causes the banks to go out of business. Those are called bank runs. So he's like, calm down, don't do it, just relax, we can get out of this. So what does FDR do? He ends up saying bank failures are awful, so to address the problem, he does a bank holiday. That's a New Deal initiative. So what a bank holiday is, he shuts down all the banks, says they're closed. He says, I'm not going to reopen them until they're healthy. Now, why do you do this? Because this stops bank runs. Bank runs were happening, and when they happen, they shut down the banks, they go out of business. So he shut them down so the bank runs couldn't happen. You can't run to a bank that's closed. So what did he do? He then passed the Emergency Banking Act. The Emergency Banking Act meant that the government would examine all those banks he shut down and only allow them to open if they're healthy. Now, what would he do? The Emergency Banking Act would take sick banks and the government would bring money to them, loan them money so they'd be healthy. But the key here was he told everybody he was doing that. So if I let a bank open, you can bet it's healthy and your money's safe. And he told everybody on those fireside chats, put your money in those banks. You can trust me and trust those banks. And suddenly, immediately, people started putting their money back in banks, which absolutely is important because banks are the center of our economy. They make the economy go, right? So bank runs almost over. Now, that works for the short term, but for the long term, in 1933, he also created something called FDIC. Now, The Glass-Steagall Act is going to create FDIC. That's a bigger bill that this is just a part of. So why does having FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, why does that help banks from closing? Because it's bank insurance. It's insurance for banks. It protects depositors and their money. Now, what do I mean by that? People are worried that if a bank shuts down, their money is gone and they'll lose all of their life savings. So they run to the bank and take their money out. By taking the money out, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It causes the bank to go out of business. So now with FDIC, if a bank goes out of business or gets robbed, the government will protect your money up to $250,000. Now that's 2020. It was $5,000 back in the day. Either way, that meant I don't care if my bank goes out of business. The government's going to give me my money anyway, so there's no reason for me to run to the bank, which inadvertently causes the bank to go out of business. So he stopped bank runs by FDIC. So bank runs solved. The emergency's kind of over because the banks are going to be saved, which is awesome. So now that American savings are safe, the top priority, let's look at the rest of the New Deal. FERA. FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Act. Now, FERA is, again, let's give relief to these people that are suffering. Now, a lot of Americans had nowhere to turn. There was no unemployment insurance. If you lost your job, you were in trouble. So people with no jobs, their families might starve. They become homeless. Hoover wouldn't give direct cash relief, so FDR says, I will, though. So FERA is going to be a federal and state cooperation program where the federal government hooks up states, gives them tons of money in order to give people that don't have jobs. Now, what did it do? Those states took this money from FERA and would build roads or build federal buildings just to create jobs, give people a job so they have money, and so on. Now, FERA ultimately used during these first 2 years over $3 billion to help out over 20 million Americans, to give them jobs or give them direct cash so they can feed their families. That's such a big change from Hoover. I mean, FERA makes FDR a hero. It helped out the unemployed, helped out the states that needed money to create programs for the unemployed, and it helped families who were going to starve without those people working. Now, another New Deal initiative, the Farm Credit Act. Now, the business cycle goes up and down. We all know that. It's harsh on everybody. People lose jobs. But it's harsher on farmers because during recessions, which happen, even successful farmers get hit the hardest because prices drastically come down, deflate, particularly back during the times of the Great Depression. So those farmers will lose so much money when prices go down because that's their entire industry, that inevitably they have foreclosures. Now, they could be the most successful ever when times are good, but they just get hit so hard during recession. So farmers have it tough. So FDR creates what's called the Farm Credit Administration. What it arranges is lower interest rates for loans to farmers that are going to be foreclosed on by banks. Lower interest rates, and also allows those loans to last longer. If they miss payments, the federal government will have their back. So more forgiving. Now, this credit organization is going to help 2 million farmers get loans that see them through the recession and support them and allow them to have longer times. Over $3 billion were given to farmers in longer periods of time for them to pay back, saving those farmers. Come 1933, farmers were happy with this bill. Again, that Farm Credit Act, a very positive thing. Another New Deal initiative, the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, the Civilian Conservation Corps, America at this point had a problem. And that problem was around every May, you had millions of young graduates, high school students, going off to the world to get a job, but there were no jobs. So these millions of teenagers did nothing. They couldn't support their family. They couldn't move out. They couldn't start their lives. Their parents couldn't support them anymore. That's a problem. So FDR said, you know what, we got to give these people some jobs. So he said, you know what, we have national parks. Let's send these young, strong, energetic people to go work in those areas. We can do some good things there. So these people were sent from their jobless lives to go plant trees in national parks. 3 billion trees were planted to make the national parks excellent. Creation of trails so that people could use them for recreation areas, trails and roads, campgrounds in the national parks. Here they are working in the CCC on campgrounds. As a result, 800 parks were created. Mosquitoes, they cleared out swamplands so the mosquitoes will be kept at bay. Irrigation on the side of roads to preserve the roads. In 1933, the CCC was a super successful program. It was run like the military, these young men. Now, they got paid $30. And they had to send $25 of that $30 home. I believe that's a month to their family. So it wasn't just the 2.5 million young people that were given jobs and something to do. It also, I mean, across the whole country, these represent where the CCC did their work, right? But it also, in addition to those young men, it helped the families of those young men. And if you remember all the hobos that were riding around the country on those trains looking for work, that was the type of people that would get hired by the CCC. So FDR hooked them up. Another program was the Agricultural Adjustment Act of the New Deal, the AAA. Now, basically, the Agricultural Adjustment Act helped out farmers again. Now, farmers didn't have any money. They were hurting now. Why were they hurting more than anybody else? Well, in World War I, the world was hungry, so American farmers stepped up and started producing a lot more food for not just the US, but all of our allies. In order to do that, they had to take out heavy bank loans to buy expensive farm equipment so that they could expand their farms and farm greater. Now, that was raining cash for them during World War I. The problem was World War I ends in the immediate time afterwards, and Europe eventually gets back on their feet and starts growing their own food. So they don't need the food from the American farmers now. The American farmers have too much food and too few customers. So that's a problem for supply and demand. Too much supply is going to bring demand down. Now, for instance, if you have that many apples, people don't really need them that badly because there's enough to go around, so they won't pay a lot for apples that are everywhere. That said, if there's hardly any apples, you're willing to pay anything for them because you can't get your hands on them. So because of supply and demand, there's so much food, the price of food drastically goes down, and farmers are working twice as hard but have almost no money for it. So the farmers' reactions to this is, well, I'm just going to plant more food so I can sell more to make up for it. And of course, when you plant even more food, the price goes down even more. And this is just going to cause farmers to be in poverty. So FDR says, well, I can do something about that. He passes the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. He says, I'm going to pay farmers to not grow their food. Now, these are called subsidies when the government pays somebody to do or not do something. Now, the AAA pays farmers to grow less crops. The hope is that by lowering supply, that brings the price and demand up. So farmers will be happier because they can sell their goods for more money, and therefore they'll be less poor. Now, it's super controversial because, number one, the American people were hungry and starving in the Depression, and here we were paying farmers a lot of money not to work, not to grow food. In fact, it's actually to pay them to grow less food. So that made people upset. Another controversial aspect of the program was the money went to farmers. But what about the millions of farmers that worked for the farmers that owned the land? When those farmers started planting less crops, they actually fired the farmers that worked for them. So that this helped the rich farmers, the big farmers, but the hired hands on the farms now lost their job. So this is actually going to hurt people, especially minorities, Hispanic Americans, African Americans, that were often not owning the land but worked on the land. Number three, about the AA, the increase of farmer incomes came at the expense of consumers. Now, what that's basically saying is that, yes, the farmers have less crops now because we're paying them. That brings the prices of food up. Now, during the Great Depression, you're actually charging more money for food. We don't have any food. So this is going to really hurt consumers. So again, during a depression, people were like, how can you have food prices go up on purpose while we're hungry and can't afford it? Now, number four of the AAA, the government is going to be using the people's money to pay farmers to burn their oranges, burn their coal, kill and slaughter their pigs, not to eat, but instead just to kill, so the price of pork goes up, especially during a time of so much hunger. Actually, about 6 million pigs just killed, so the price of pork would go up to help the farmers. $200 million was paid by the federal government to plow over cotton, just so that the price of cotton would go up for all the farmers. What a waste. So the farmers were helped out. The farm workers not, many fired. Consumers were upset because they had higher prices. So the AA really helped farmers, which was its purpose. Starving, of course, not happy because their prices were going up on food at the time they needed to. Another New Deal initiative was the 18th Amendment. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was passed. Now, why? Because we already studied this, but basically the 18th Amendment banning of alcohol led to organized crime, corruption, dangerous alcohol, moonshine, taxes. We used to tax alcohol. Now federal government and states lost money. Prohibition seemed ineffective. So in 1933, FDR passed a law. You don't need to remember this law, but it made beer legal, low alcohol beer. And then it eventually led to prohibition being overturned, right? The 21st Amendment. Why did FDR push that? Because you bring back alcohol, that creates millions of jobs, whether bartenders, bars, transporting alcohol, producing alcohol. So getting rid of prohibition made workers happy, anybody who was against prohibition happy, and of course drinkers kind of happy in a weird way. Now, another New Deal initiative was the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. So the Tennessee Valley Authority is going to deal with a problem that the U.S. has. The poorest region of the country was around Tennessee, all the area around it, not just Tennessee, but the area around it. Now, it was poor by even Great Depression standards. Now, there's a lot of rivers that run through that area, and those rivers lead to a lot of flooding. So particularly in the spring with all the rains, and that flooding kills and destroys. So FDR says, I have an idea, let's create the TVA. The TVA will build like 50 dams to dam up those rivers so we can control the rivers and release water when we want to so that they do not flood. So here's just a couple dams. If you look, you can see the dams all over it. So these rivers were dammed up. Now, the benefit of it was we stopped the flooding, which killed people and destroyed things. But it also, to build all those dams, created thousands, tens of thousands of construction jobs. And that's going to help those jobs are going to go to the poorest people in the country. Huge benefit. Also, a third benefit of the TVA is the generation of electricity. When you run water through a dam, they have turbines there. The water pushes the turbines around and it creates electricity for free. You don't have to burn oil or coal. You just get it automatically from this water and gravity. So all that electricity would massively raise the standard of living of these very poor people that didn't have electricity. If you think about what your life would be without electricity, these people were poor and miserable and sad, and now they had free electricity. Not only that, but if you have electricity in the region, that attracts businesses. Businesses will move there because they can now run their factories. So economically speaking, the TVA is a godsend, creates jobs after jobs. Now, there was a trade-off. When you dam up a river, and there were like a lot of dams, it basically stops the water from flowing and creates a massive lake. That lake now exists where there used to be homes and people. So 15,000 people were told, you know what, you're going to lose your home. And that's a sad thing when somebody loses their home. In fact, they had to dig up and relocate cemeteries, which is kind of a very sad thing as well. So the TVA had some trade-offs. Now, the Tennessee Valley really helped out with all those dams, electricity, and jobs. But some people, of course, maybe not. Well, in 1935, Roosevelt is now like, all right, I'm giving you some relief and hopefully you recover. Now I'm going to change the system, fix it so this never happens again, a little reform. So he launches what's called the second 100 days, the second New Deal. So a new group of laws and ideas. Now, the biggest one ever is the Works Progress Administration, better known as the WPA. So the Works Progress Administration is actually going to absorb some previous job-creating programs, but this one's going to target people with no skills, people with, not no skills, but minimal skills, people that aren't really great at any one thing. So, so either way, it's the largest program of the New Deal, and it generates 8.5 million jobs, massively helping people. Thousands of projects all over the U.S., building roads. So basically what the WPA would do is they would call up a state or a local area and say, what do you need? And then, oh, we need this. We need a new road. And they would give them money to hire all these people to build that road. So why not get these people working, doing useful things, build sidewalks, build public buildings, town halls, firehouses, schools. The WPA just built bridges and roads and everything that towns would need all across the country. Such an amazing program to put people to work during a time when they needed to. The goal was full employment. We never got there, but man, it was a huge step in that direction. WPA was awesome. It also helped writers, hiring them to make state guides for states. It interviewed slaves that were still alive and got that history written down so that it could be in the history books. A lot of what we learned today from the 1800s was gotten during this time period by the WPA programs. Artists were paid to paint paintings and so on, and they're still hung up in post offices all around the country. Murals, people were paid to make murals to make cities look good. Statues were designed. Actors were paid to be in places like Boston Common to put on free theater. Basically, FDR was like, we need to give people work. We need to give them something to do or our country is going to be destroyed. And that's what the WPA was about. Find work for everybody who needed a job. So unskilled laborers, they got work. Anybody who needed a job, they're happy. The economy was happy with the WPA because all those people got money to spend, which stimulates the economy. Another New Deal program was the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Now, the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1920s, basically in the 1920s, people were buying lots of homes, but they got these huge mortgages. Didn't matter. They were making tons of money. But 1929 comes, the Great Depression strikes, and people lose their jobs, and their homes get foreclosed on when they can't pay their mortgages. The banks take their homes back. So 1933, FDR creates the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Why is this helpful? Well, like before, it lowered interest rates. It basically said, from now on, we're going to support the banks. We're going to give you lower interest rate loans. Now, why were the banks comfortable with this under the Homeowners Loan Corporation? Because now the federal government said, we're going to give people longer to pay them back. So now their payments will be smaller and everybody can be more forgiving if people miss a payment, and therefore it's lower risk and therefore lower interest rates will be charged. So 30-year loans became a thing because of the Great Depression and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is now if you buy a house, you don't have 3 years to pay back your loan, you have 30 years, which is super helpful for society. Another aspect of the Homeowners Loan Corporation is if you missed a couple payments, rather than the bank seizing your house during the Great Depression, the government would have your back and insure your loan. So the bank wouldn't seize your house right away. The government would give you time to get back on your feet. So millions of homes were saved. Thank you, FDR and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. I can't even imagine what life was like before you. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation helped homeowners and families. Maybe the greatest law ever passed was Social Security. Now, Social Security is going to help Americans in 3 ways. Social Security, the U.S. had a problem. The elderly were the most vulnerable population, vulnerable to sickness. They needed support, and this was all very super expensive, right? When you get old and somewhat helpless, it's expensive to take care of yourself. And the problem is that's at a time when you can't even work. You know, when we get to a certain age, you can't put in 40 hours a week to make money to pay for all the help you need. So FDR said, yeah, I have an idea. In 1935, he passes Social Security, and the U.S. government under Social Security requires that Americans have to save money, that they lose money from every paycheck that goes into a fund called Social Security. Now, you're going to lose all that money from age 14 to 65. Every single paycheck, money taken out. And from age 62 to 70, originally 65, the U.S. government would then start giving it back to you to take care of you when you're old, so that everybody is forced to be taken care of when they're elderly. It's the greatest law ever because it provided our whole country a safety net at a time when you absolutely need it when you're of advanced age. Now, there was another problem with the, basically some people opposed Social Security when it happened. Why were they opposed to it? Because the government was taking people's money. And they thought that was bad because it obstructed freedom, but also spending is good. And if the government's taking your money, you can't spend it. So another thing, some people were like, hey, I would much rather use my own money to pay for my own retirement. I'm going to invest in Apple stock. And people were upset. Now I can't. The government's just taking it. What happens if you get sick and don't make it to age 65? You paid into Social Security your whole life and never took any money out. It's totally unfair. Some people thought this was a socialistic program like Russia and communism, you know, the government taking over and forcing people to do things. So, but I would say, no, it's awesome. It forces people to save. And that's amazing because that means we'll all be taken care of when we're older. Social Security had another aspect of its program back then. The problem was unemployed people really suffer. Now, and their families suffer. Why should families suffer? I don't know. So FDR said, I need to solve this. So FDR created basically a program under Social Security that became unemployment insurance. Now, today, a lot of unemployment insurance isn't run through Social Security, but it's the first national program was. So the national unemployment compensation through Social Security meant if you lost your job, you no longer starved to death or lost your home necessarily. the government would give you money. And of course, that is the ultimate safety net. When you lose your job, you don't starve. The government will give you money till you get back on your feet. It's the best thing ever. And when you get that money, you can keep spending it, which stimulates the economy, gets the economy going again, so that maybe you can find a job. Now, what happened before this? Well, no, you just suffered. If you didn't have family to take care of you, you were on the street, which is, of course, what happened under Herbert Hoover, right? So Social Security is a great thing, although some people think unemployment insurance leads to people being lazy. They can just get paid for not working. They'll lose the will to work. And that's a little bit what Hoover had been saying. As a compromise, President Bill Clinton in the Republican Congress in the 1990s basically said, you know what, unemployment compensation, we're going to limit to 2 years. That's as long as you can possibly stay on it. Now, that was the 1990s where suddenly welfare and unemployment compensation was kind of tempered a little bit. Now, Social Security, number 3, in addition to unemployment insurance and old age pension, there's another aspect of it, disabled insurance. Basically, you pay into Social Security your whole life, and then if you get so disabled that you can't work anymore, either permanently or temporarily, you can collect Social Security. It means the government will keep paying you so that you don't starve. And that was the idea. Once again, this huge safety net, making Social Security the best law ever for taking care of people in need. So the elderly love Social Security, the disabled, the unemployed, amazing. Now we're almost done, but another law of the New Deal was the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act had a very formal name called the National Labor Relations Act. However, let's talk about the problem. The problem in 1935 was that management and labor did not get along, and they had a total inequitable relationship. Management was way too powerful. They gave terrible wages, and there was nothing that workers could do about it. All the money was had by the rich and the business owners, kind of, and the rights of workers could be crushed because businesses could do whatever they want, and workers just had to deal with it for the most part. So a huge part of this is many businesses wouldn't recognize unions. Unions would say, we want to negotiate, we want this, and they wouldn't even listen. And there was no law that forced them to listen. So there was no law that forced businesses to collectively bargain. Whereas in other words, there's no law forcing them to talk to a union, recognize them, but also to negotiate with them. Just ignore them. And then it's like the union doesn't exist. Now, why do we need unions? Because unions advocate for workers and make their lives better. Now, if you tried to attempt to form a union, you could be fired on the spot. There was no law protecting you. So the result of this is businesses had all the power to be abusive towards workers, and unions didn't even have to be talked to. So unions couldn't fight and advocate, so the power was totally skewed. So that's bad for society, and it's part of what led to the Great Depression. So FDR says, he passes the Wagner Act and says from now on, businesses have to recognize unions, and unions have to have the right to form. Now, if 51% of employees want to form a union, they have the right to form it, and now they're government protected. Now, there's no businesses can't pressure you not to join a union. Collective bargaining, once a union forms, the union negotiates with the business, and the union has so much more powerful than individuals do. So this is going to, again, the classic example is if I walk into my boss and say, I want a raise, he's like, no, I'll just fire you and hire somebody else. But if 800 workers walk in and say, we want a raise, the boss has to take us seriously and compromise with us, because that's a lot of power, right? So the fact that the businesses are now required under the Wagner Act to collectively bargain means that this is the beginning of businesses having to share the wealth and share the decision-making with workers, which is going to lead to a much more equitable situation. I mean, it's still a battle, but it's a thing. So unions are happy with the Wagner Act. It's going to shift things in society quite well. Working class or all workers are going to be happy. Anybody joining a union, society is going to be much more equitable. Still a long way to go, but a huge step in the right direction. Business owners, not so much. They had to give up a lot of power under the Wagner Act. They had to negotiate with unions. They had to give up power, and unions now had control and 50% of the say. So this is going to take power away from business owners, and depending on your philosophy, that's either a good or bad thing. Because if you think that you start a business and you should have 100% control, that's one perspective. But some people think that your labor force is doing most of the work, and therefore they should have a huge amount of say to protect themselves. So, not sure, but that was the Wagner Act. Now, one of our final things we're going to talk about is the New Deal initiative, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is complicated because it actually did 3 things. First, the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 U.S. had a problem, and that was that the U.S. was giving terrible pay to workers. So what did FDR do about it besides the whole union business? He passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. It required a minimum wage to be paid to everybody in America. Well, not to everybody, but to most people in America. Now, the minimum wage, I think, started off at a wee bit under $1, and today it's approaching $15, right? This is the federal minimum wage. A lot of progressive states already had a minimum wage. A lot of the conservative ones did not. So this is going to force all the states to pay people at least a little bit. Now, why is that good? Because it stops or minimizes how much businesses can exploit workers. They have to at least pay them a certain amount. It also stops a little systemic prejudice, because if you have to pay everybody at least a certain amount, then you can't exploit people differently. A lot of people have a set amount that they're going to make. So it also, a lot of people are like, listen, the hardest workers often work for around minimum wage. But the problem is they're working all those hours, yet they don't have enough money to pay rent and buy food. So by having a minimum wage, we raise what businesses pay workers, and now hopefully they can have a livable wage. They can work all those hours and still survive. So a lot of people oppose minimum wage. They think it hurts businesses, because it does. It forces them to pay more. And that leads to inflation, because businesses are going to raise their prices because their costs have gone up. They have to pay workers more. Some people think workers don't need minimum wage, that, hey, businesses follow basic economics. If their workers are getting paid too little, their workers leave, and then therefore businesses to stay in business will have to raise what they're paying their workers. So you don't need the government to interfere. So this is called kind of the invisible hand of economics. So the Fair Labor Standards Act says, whatever, I'm going to force businesses to not exploit workers and pay them a certain amount. Workers, I think, are happy. Businesses, not so much. The Fair Labor Standards Act also does, number 2, the U.S. had an additional problem, and that was they worked, child labor was not banned in every state. Some states, yes, but many others, no. So children were still forced to work, and children, of course, got hurt so easily. They should have been in school. If you look at this chart very clearly, most states did not require people to stay in school until 18. They just didn't. People were allowed to work. And this, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, from now on in all the states, everybody's expected to be in school until 18, not to work until that point. So the Fair Labor Standards Act, I'm sorry, not 18, but 16, but basically said no child labor everywhere. So children are going to be saved, parents are going to be happy, businesses not so much, because they liked employing children, they could pay them less, they were more docile. Now the Fair Labor Standards Act is for the third and final thing it does. It deals with this problem. Workers have to work massively long hours because businesses would just tell them, no, you're working 80 hours this week. You know, some people would get up so early the sun was down. And then when they got out of work, the sun went down again and they never saw light. Depressing. So workers need protection from this abuse. The Fair Labor Standards Act did that. It basically said from right away that businesses can only work people for 44 hours. It was later reduced to 40. And that is great. Now, some people were upset. They're like, no, this hurts businesses. American businesses need to work their workers longer to be productive, to compete with foreign businesses. We want our country to be productive, right, for everybody to make money. Workers were like, I want to work 60 hours a week. I need the money. So a compromise was reached. Fine. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, you can work more than 40 hours a week, which comes out to 8 hours a day, 5 times a week, but you have to be paid overtime. So it allowed workers to work more hours. It allowed businesses to work them, but if businesses wanted to do it, they had to pay a little bit more, time and a half. So workers got happy by this. Businesses, not so much. Nice compromise. And I think our final one, New Deal initiative, was the Securities Act. So the U.S. had a problem, and that was that the stock market was funky, basically corrupt. The government needed to regulate it, so regulate companies, all companies that sold stocks and bonds, basically called securities. Now the problem is that it has been that unhealthy companies would communicate that their companies were awesome, and they would lie, and then clueless investors like me would keep buying their stock. And then what would happen? The stock would crash, but the leaders of the company knew. They knew that it was a bad company, so they sold all their stock and made a killing. You know who was left holding the bag? This guy, the investors. They lost everything in 1929 when the market crashed. But all the people that were running the company, They got out. They were fine. So FDR says this ain't happening. He passes the Securities Act, which requires under law that all businesses provide honest and constant information about their health, their revenue, and everything about them, so that investors know everything about companies and no companies can lie to them, so that no clueless investors are buying bad stock and end up losing everything. Now, number two thing about the Securities Act, insider trading. What would happen is insider trading is when somebody knows somebody that works for a company, maybe even themselves, and they know that a company is about to become huge and their stock price is going to go up, or they know that a company is about to fail and they should sell stock quickly. So that person working in the company sells all their stock, or they tell their friends or family to sell all their stock or to buy it. And then they make a killing because they know secret information, insider information. So the Securities Act is going to make that illegal. And if you work for a company, you have to keep all of that secret and you can't act on that information. So if you do, the Securities and Exchange Commission is going to arrest you and throw you in prison for a long time. And that is what this did, because when the stock market crashed, all those rich people saw it coming, and all the people working for those companies, and they sold their stock early. And that just means that the investors took the hit, the common people, and that's not okay. So the Securities Act is going to protect investors. Now, we talked about the New Deal, the legacy of it, the lessons. Now, the legacy is that the role of government is forever changed. From now on, people expect the government to save them and support them. And that just wasn't it prior to FDR. Now, another legacy of the New Deal is it drastically changed our country from a failing form of capitalism. And the Great Depression was a failure to a huge chunk of socialism. I would still argue we're mostly capitalist, but we have just enough socialism to keep us balanced, where the government is running the economy and protecting Americans when the capitalism fails. It's another huge aspect of, or should I say legacy of the Great Depression and the New Deal, was we now have a safety net. If I lose my job, I have unemployment insurance, so me and my family don't starve. If I get old, I now have Social Security to take care of me when I'm old. If I become disabled and can't work, the government takes care of me. And that is awesome. Thank you, Social Security. Another part of the legacy, you know what? Hoover and everybody before him thought a balanced budget was appropriate. Nobody should spend money they don't have. That's wrong. Well, FDR is like, no, I'm going to do deficit spending. I'm going to spend money I don't have to stimulate the economy. And we've never looked back. We owe so much unbelievable money that every president since then is happy with spending more money than we have. And our country could not have more debt. And we have to pay so much interest on that every year. It's one of the most depressing things I've heard of. But hey, we got to figure it out somehow, right? Now, did the New Deal work? And the answer is yes. If you look, if you look at my mouse, here is the Great Depression. And then the New Deal is going to be so much spending that we get much better. But we actually don't get out of the Great Depression. The New Deal kind of fails in a way. And the reason is, it was just, we did not spend enough to get out of the Depression. You know what did get us to spend? Preparing for Hitler. So the preparations for World War II drove us out of the economy and created the jobs we needed. So that is the legacy. World War II got us out of the Great Depression, not the New Deal, but the New Deal did help. So thank you for listening. Look for your assignment in Google Classroom. And up next, we're going to talk about World War II.